Okay, so over here I have an example. So this is what our finished sample will look like. This is a placket like you see at the center front of a shirt, one that is not fully buttoned down, so the buttons don't go all the way to the hem, but it just has that portion that opens up near the neckline. So this would be the neckline, shoulders, armholes, and this would be the placket that opens on the front. And so it would just open up. This one, the only thing that it's missing are those buttons and buttonholes. So for our sample, we won't actually put buttons and buttonholes on them, but we will have this type of placket on our final garment, which is our dress shirt. And we will have, you know, full buttons and buttonholes on that garment. So this gives you an idea of what it's going to look like. Let's go ahead and get into the pieces. We've got 4 different pattern pieces for this one. I'll go ahead and start with the main bodice. So this is just a front bodice. Should look very familiar to what we've used in the past, except this one has this line coming down center front, and that's where the opening is going to be for our placket. And then we've got our actual placket piece. So this one, instead of just notches on the edges, we've got our full seam allowances marked. And we've got this dotted line in the middle. That's where we're going to stitch around the opening. And then the center line going down here is the actual opening. So we'll get to that, but we're going to mark all of these onto our fabric, including our seam allowances on the edges, because all of them will be very important and we'll need to know the exact seam line whenever we get to stitching it. And then we should have 2 little fusing pieces. The longer one will sit over on the longer side, filling in that side of the placket. And then the shorter one will sit on this shorter side, just inside the seam allowance on both sides. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started marking, and we'll fuse as well. So I'm going to start with my bodice. So on the back side of the fabric, I need to mark this line where this opening is. So I went ahead and used my awl and just punched a hole through the end of that line. And now I'm going to flip it over to the wrong side of the fabric. Put that down on there, and I can transfer off that little hole at the end of the line. So punch through that hole. And then at the top of the line, I'm just going to make a little mark to see where the top of the line is. And then I can just connect those 2 dots to transfer off that line. So I just scooted my paper down a little bit so I could make a little mark at the top of that line. And then I'll take my ruler and just connect the 2. So I'm using a disappearing ink pen. You're welcome to use your chalk. Either one is fine. Okay, so there's my full line marked. That's my opening. I'm going to set that aside, and now we're going to mark our placket. So again, on the wrong side of the fabric, we need to mark all of these lines. So I'm going to flip over. The first one I'm going to mark is this center opening area. So on the bottom, you'll see there are these 3 points. We need to transfer off. I poked those through with a hole so I can flip it over and transfer those off onto my fabric using my awl. And then again, I'm just going to scoot my paper down a little bit so I can get the top of those 3 lines. Okay, and now I need to mark down from that top point down to the drill holes that I marked down here. Okay, so I've got those three. Now I need to get this little triangle. So here where there's a diagonal line connecting those three dots, I'm going to trace those. So I'm just going to connect those dots diagonally. Okay, and now I should be ready to mark all of the seam allowances going around the outside edge. So these two on the edge and the one going horizontal here are all 1/2 inch. I can see on my paper. And then the ones down at the pointed part of the placket are 1/4 inch. So I'm going to go ahead and mark those 1/2 inch ones first. So over here on the shorter side, I'm going to do 1/2 inch. Across the horizontal bottom, do 1/2 inch. And then on this long side over here, I'll do 1/2 inch as well. Okay, and then on these three sides, the short one going straight down and the two diagonal ones, those are just 1/4 inch. We can see that over here on our paper. Okay, now that we've got all that marked, we're ready to put our interfacing on. So I'm going to grab my two little strips that I cut out. The longer one, like I said, is going to sit just inside that seam allowance. So the one that we just marked is going to sit just inside that. So you should have an empty 1/2 inch right here. And it should go all the way from the top edge down to where it won't fill in the little point, but it will go to where that kind of flattens out at the bottom. And then the short one will go on the other side. Again, from top, and then the seam allowance at the bottom will be empty. Make sure you always check that that truly adhered before you move on. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is along those two edges on the outside edges, we're going to create a basting stitch, and that's going to act as a guide for us to fold in those seam allowances. So right along this long vertical edge and the shorter vertical edge, we're going to do a basting stitch. So let's take it over to our machine and we'll do that. Okay, over here, I'm going to go push my stitch length up to a 4.0 for a basting. And then I'm just going to follow that line that I marked all the way down. No need to back stitch for a baste. So just went down that side. There we go. Okay, and then same thing on the other short side. And now we're going to take this back to our ironing board. Okay, back over here, I'm going to use both of those basting stitches as a guide to fold in my seam allowance. So I'm still looking at the wrong side of my fabric. I'm going to fold in that seam allowance and press it right on that basting stitch line. I'm going to go ahead and remove these tails that are sticking off. One more. There we go. Okay, now we're ready to start putting this onto our shirt. So I'm going to grab my bodice. Again, I'm looking at the wrong side of the fabric where we marked that line. And I'm going to take my placket and put it face down. So I should be looking at the wrong side for both of them. Wrong side here, wrong side here. And I'm going to match up this middle line with the middle line that's going right down the center of my placket. Those two should be the same length and should match up. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and pin those together. And what we're about to do is we're going to stitch around that rectangle. So on your pattern piece, it'll be those dotted lines. We're going to stitch down one side, across the bottom here at that 1/2 inch, and then up the other dotted line. So I'm going to pin that together on here, and then we'll take it over to stitch it. Okay, let's take that over and stitch it down. Okay, so I'm going to start over on my left-hand side, work my way down, go across the bottom, and then I'll come up this right-hand side. Make sure that you turn your stitch length back down to a 2.5. And I want to go just down to that corner and not past it. So just like we did on the welt pocket, make sure that you're stopping right on that corner. If you need to adjust your stitch length and turn it down so that your needle is moving forward a smaller amount, you can do that to make it a little bit more accurate and make sure that you don't go too far past the corner. I'm going to have to turn it down for this one. So I'm going to go down to a 1.5. There we go. And that helps me land right on my corner. And then I push it back up to a 2.5. Okay, so there's the full rectangle stitched across that bottom. Let's head over and we'll start cutting the opening of our placket. Okay, as always, to begin with, we're going to take off those thread tails from the last stitch we did. Okay, and now we're going to cut down that center line and then diagonally out to the corners. And you should have that fully marked on your pattern. So this center solid line and then those little diagonal lines out to the corners we're about to cut through. So I'm going to turn it upside down so I can cut from this neckline down. And I'm cutting through both layers, through the placket and the shirt. Okay, when I get to those diagonal lines, I'm going to split off directly to the corner. And on this one, we want to make sure we get as close as possible to that corner. Before, I've told you on other samples, I've told you make sure you don't get too close to the corner so that it doesn't begin to fray and your stitches don't come out whenever you manipulate that seam. But on this one, it's okay to get as close as possible. So you want to go all the way out to the corner. As long as you're not cutting through your actual stitches, you're good. Okay, now we're going to start flipping these. I'm going to go to the right side and we're going to start flipping these to the front. But before we flip them all the way to the outside, we need to press our seams. So I'm going to flip one side and then I'm going to bust open that seam. And then I'm going to press both seam allowances towards the placket. So get both of those over and press it again. Okay. Same for the other side. So flip this one out, bust it open. And then press both towards the placket. And then the last little portion we have to do is that little triangle that's at the bottom. So you can see my little triangle here. I want to try and get that seam flat on my table so I can bust open those two little triangles. Separate them and press that seam flat. Okay. Now we'll head back to the front of the shirt. And we should have both of our plackets sticking off the edge like this. We're going to pull them to where they are right side out. And it reveals that rectangle opening. So this is now our big rectangle opening that we're going to cover with our placket. I should be looking at the right side of my placket and the right side of my shirt. Before I move on, I'm going to press just this bottom of the rectangle, this little seam. Don't worry about the vertical ones yet. So make sure the seam is right on the edge for that little bottom portion and press it. And then we need to transfer our marking. So we had that horizontal marking that went across our placket. We're just going to transfer that to the outside. So I'm going to put my ruler in line with the bottom of the rectangle, and I'm going to transfer that line off all the way across. And we'll use this as a stitching guide later on. Okay. Now we're ready to start folding these sides of our placket to create the part that's going to cover this opening. So I'm going to do this shorter side first. That's the one that's going to sit behind. Part of my seam on the edge where that basting stitch is, it came a little bit unpressed. So I'm going to repress that real quick. Okay. Okay, so get that right side out of the way. I'm just going to pull it off a little bit. So now I'm looking at this left-hand side. I'm going to pull it to where I'm looking, let it stick off the edge to where I'm looking at the back of it. And I see those seam allowances. And then I'm going to fold it in half so that that edge where the basting stitch is comes over to this edge where our stitch line is for those seam allowances. So I'm going to fold it in half. It should be an inch wide after you've folded it in half. And you're just barely going to cover up that stitch line, the one that's right here on the right-hand side. Just barely cover it up so it's not visible anymore. Okay, we're going to press that. Like I said, it should be an inch wide the whole way down. So if you need to use your ruler to double check that, make sure it's nice and even, you can do that. Okay, and then what we're about to do is we're going to pin it down where this opening is on the side. We're going to pin it down and we're going to do an edge stitch to secure it down to the shirt. So let's pin it first. Okay, and we're going to do an edge stitch and we're going to stop at that line that we marked. So you can see my line here. I'm going to stop my edge stitch right there at that line. So let's go stitch that part. Okay, so I'm going to start all the way up at the neckline. Put my needle down first so I know exactly where I'm starting. And this is an edge stitch, so it's as close to that edge as you can get. The official measurement in the industry is a 1/16 of an inch. That is very small. So you should have an 1/8 of an inch marked on your foot. And you can just go right in the middle, halfway to that 1/8 of an inch mark if you're trying to have a guide to measure from. Go nice and slow on this part because you don't want to accidentally go off the edge. And then if you do that, you won't be catching the placket and it won't fully close. Let's get this part flat over here so you can stitch all the way to the bottom. Okay, and then just down to that marking line that we did. And then back stitch. Okay. So there's my edge stitch going all along that side of the placket. Let's head back to our ironing board. Okay, remove any thread tails that you have hanging off. Okay, and now we're ready to do the other side of the placket. For this one, again, I'm going to let it stick off so that I'm looking at the wrong side of my placket. And I'm going to fold it in half just like we did the other one so that it barely covers up the seam line that's right here. And again, it should be an inch wide once you've pressed it. Okay, and I'm just pressing it down to that horizontal line. I'm not worried about this bottom portion, this pointed area yet. We'll do that in a minute. So just from the top down to that horizontal line. Once you lay it properly, it should exactly overlap that other placket. They should stack up right on top of each other. Okay, I'm going to get this one out of the way. So pull it down out of the way. And we're going to do an edge stitch on both sides of this one. We really only need it on this outside edge where the opening is to close it. But since this is the one that's going to be visible on the front of the shirt, we want to do an edge stitch on both sides just so it has a nice consistent look on both sides. So let me pin this one and then we'll go edge stitch. Okay, let's go edge stitch this one. Okay, so I'm going to do this left-hand side first so I can close up that placket. No, I don't like it from this side. I'm going to flip it, do it upside down. So I'm going to go from the marking up to the neckline just so I can have my pins on that right-hand side. Okay, and then I'm just going to flip around and do the same thing on this inside edge. Just down to that horizontal marking. Okay, let's take that back to our ironing board. Okay, again, cut off any thread tails that you have hanging out. Okay. And now we're ready to stack these up, and then we're going to stitch that lower portion where the point is. So make sure that your neckline on both placket pieces, that your neckline is exactly even at the top, and they should sit one right on top of the other. I'm going to go ahead and throw a couple pins in there just to hold them together while I press the bottom portion. Okay, now for this little bottom portion, we need to turn in under our raw edges. These two edges on the sides should already be partially pressed, but we need to fully form them and make sure that they're the right shape that we want. So that means they're nice and even, parallel, they're only an inch apart. It doesn't get wider or more narrow as they go down. And then we'll fold in those little diagonal points as well. So let's do these left and right edges first. You have your markings on the back. So if you look at the inside of your fabric, you have your markings there. So you can use those as a guide. And you can adjust it so that it looks as even as possible. So whatever pressing you're doing right now is going to determine the final shape of this placket. So you want it to look as nice and professional as possible. So now I'm going to do those two little diagonal lines where I just fold under the raw edge right on that 1/4 inch line and press it. And again, we want these to be even. So if there is any adjusting you need to do it now before you stitch. Okay. I'm going to pin down these points, these little corners here. And at this point, all of your seam allowances should be tucked under there. You shouldn't see any raw edges. If you have any sticking out, so you can see how mine right here from that under placket is wanting to stick out, make sure to tuck that under. So I'm going to go ahead and just fold that and tuck it under so it's hidden. There we go. And then pin down that top placket. So now you can see how I tucked that under right there. Nothing should be sticking out. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to take this over to our machine. We'll stitch across that diagonal line that we marked, and then we'll go around all of the edges with an edge stitch to finish it off. Okay, so I'm going to start with that diagonal line at the top. Right where my edge stitch is, right here where that corner is right where I want to start my stitching. So it stays in line with that edge stitch that I did on the top placket. Make sure my under placket isn't sticking out at all. I need to put one more pin in here. There we go. Start with your back stitch. I'm going to stop again right where my edge stitch, in line with that edge stitch on the other side. So that way when I pivot and go down right here, it's in line with what was up above. Every time you turn a corner, make sure that you stop with your needle down in the fabric so you can lift up and pivot without losing your spot. And then again, it should be right in line with that edge stitch that happened up above. And now I'm going to back stitch, and I'm done. Okay, back to our ironing board. Okay, so this is our finished Popover placket. And this is the type that we will do on our dress shirt for our final project. The only thing that's missing that we'll do on our final garment, but not on the sample, is button and buttonholes to close up this little placket. So buttonholes would go on the top, buttons would go down below, and they would button together to close out the shirt.